An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Ideas that the punishment should fit the crime can be traced back to the earliest of all laws, Hammurabi's Code. To put it simply, if the crime you committed was grave, then so shall the punishment be for said crime. Generally within the West, this has led to an idea of a hierarchy of crimes, one where murder and rape are at the top, and pirating Netflix shows or handling salmon suspiciously are at the bottom, and yes, that's a real thing, we promise. Societies, however, rarely agree with one another as to what crimes are at the top of the hierarchy, what crimes deserve the worst punishments. So what happens when two societies collide, where the gravest of all punishments is given to tourists from a country that'd barely give a decade in jail? This is the unfortunate story of the Bali 9. The date is April the 5th, 2005. Young, 19-year-old Michael Sagai has completed his first and only international trip, leaving his home of Australia for a short break in Indonesia. Traveling with him is his school friend Scott Rush. They're traveling 2 days after fellow school friends Renee Lawrence and Martin Stevens. All of them hail from the land down under. Luckily for our adventurous tourists, none need to worry about a place to stay. All 4 of our adventurers have prepaid rooms and $5,000 in cash, courtesy of fellow Aussies Andrew Chan and Myran Sukumaran. But let's not get ahead of ourselves yet. Let's speak a little bit about the destination. Big trouble in little Indonesia. Indonesia, 55,000 kilometers of sun, sea, great food, and of course, many, many drugs. A survey conducted in 2004 estimated that 1.5% of the population over 15 had used drugs, which is strange considering that 9.6% of the UK population is estimated to have done so, and as much as 30% of the US population. So you may be asking, why is Indonesia connected with drugs? Well, apart from the obvious suspicions that question raises, there is one simple answer. You don't try your own product. Indonesia has been described by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime as one of Asia's main drug trafficking hubs. To clarify, it's not that Indonesia produces the most drugs and it doesn't consume the most drugs, but it does seem to act as almost a market for drugs that are produced elsewhere. Although at this point, it is worth issuing a word of warning to any of our more adventurous viewers out there. Indonesia may be famous for its number of trafficking laws, but it's also infamous for its punishment for drug smuggling, ranging from routine police beatings all the way up to the most severe punishment in the land. It is with this background to every university student's #1 holiday location that we can better understand what drew our 6 intrepid Aussies to the archipelago. A world of mystery and a certain lack of subtlety. It is no overestimation to say that we here at this channel are far from being experts on drug smuggling, but you would imagine that one talent you'd need to be a drug smuggler would be subtlety. Now, if you want to avoid spoilers for what happens to our adventurous Aussies, then you should look away now, for it was not only our 4 students that arrived in Indonesia. Rather unsurprisingly, the Australian authorities had caught on to this not-so-subtle plot. You see, this was not Sukumaran or Chan's first rodeo. Back in 2004, both had successfully imported what is referred to as commercial-quality heroin into Australia from Indonesia. In fact, they had been investigated for so long that only 1 month after our adventurous bunch had landed in Indonesia, that an entire syndicate's worth of drug smugglers had been arrested, a syndicate who Sukumaran and Chan were supposedly members of. In fact, relevant to the controversies, as we shall cover later, the Indonesian authorities were said to have no clue of the plot until agents of the AFP, the Australian Federal Police, informed the Indonesian authorities of the identities of those involved. A holiday dreams are made of. Now back to the happy adventures of Rush and Chagai. You see, after arriving in Indonesia, most of the smugglers were reported to have spent a long time inside their hotel room. I imagine that any of us who broke our mum's vase when we were a kid would understand the anxiety they must have felt. Despite this, Rush and Chagai were reported to have been making the most of their holiday, spending time shopping, eating, drinking, and going diving. Like I said, real subtle. On the 16th, however, the holiday had ended and it was time to leave their fun behind and engage in the serious criminal enterprise that they'd come to the country for in the first place. On the 17th, the group of 6 made their way to airports and all were promptly arrested. Now, it's at this point that any numerically gifted viewers might be asking, well, it's called the Bali 9, so where are the rest? Well, it was not only the smugglers that lacked subtlety, but also the producers. Alongside Sakamaran, Chan, Chugai, Rush, Stevens, and Lawrence, also were arrested Si Yi Chen, Tan Duk Fan Nguyen, and Matthew Norman. The three being arrested in a hotel with Sakamaran, while the rest of our adventurers made their way to the airport. Rush, Stevens, Lawrence, and Chugai were all arrested as they made their way through airport security. Each had a total of 8.3 kilograms of heroin in plastic bags at various places around their bodies. Chan was arrested shortly after these four, having made it to the seat of an Australian Airlines flight before being escorted off by a mixture of AFP agents and Indonesian police. Notably, found on Chan at the time of his arrest were 3 separate mobile phones. After the dream comes the nightmare. So, not all is looking good. Their carefully planned and executed subtle plot akin to that of a Bond villain has somehow been foiled. It's at this point that what Amnesty International would describe as a contentious issue begins to enter the story. For starters, all 9 members of the group were held up until the 22nd of April without charge. For reference, in the United Kingdom, you must be charged within 24 hours of arrest or 48 hours in exceptional circumstances only. Now, this may not appear as an important point, except this is where that snazzy intro comes into relevance. As mentioned earlier, Indonesia is known as one of the drug capitals of the world, not because of usage, but because of traffic. For that reason, Indonesia has introduced what Amnesty International would refer to as a second contentious issue to try and combat drug smuggling. That's right, it's time for us to mention the death penalty. Specifically, Indonesia allows for the death penalty in cases of drug trafficking where offences of possession would only hold a maximum of 10 years. However, of course, Indonesia wouldn't execute citizens of another country. Right? That's like majorly against the rules of international relations. You don't kill someone else's citizens. Well, unfortunately, it's not really true. Indonesia disagreed. On the 27th of April 2005, Colonel Sugiarto, head of Bali's drug squad, stated that the police would seek to charge all 9 defendants, all of whom were Australian citizens, with the capital offence. So, well, maybe the judges at least would not give them the death penalty. Well, not exactly. On the 14th of February 2006, Chan and Sakamaran gained the onerous honour of becoming the targets of the first ever death sentences passed by the Denpasar District Court. All other defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment, with Lawrence and Rush being sentenced on the 13th of February, Chugai and Stevens being sentenced on the 14th, and the remaining 3 being sentenced on the 15th. And now at this point you might be thinking, well, I'm not going to lose faith. There's still the appeals process, right? Surely that'll save them. Well, on the 26th of April 2006, Lawrence, Nguyen, Chan, and Norman all had their sentences reduced to 20 years, only for prosecutors to then have Chen's 20 years upgraded at no extra cost to a death sentence on the 6th of September 2006. Rush, Nguyen, and Norman subsequently also had their appeals overturned and received this upgraded plan. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, so the prosecution won? Well, not exactly. You see, what was so shocking about this was that the prosecutors only requested life imprisonment to be instated by the court. Luckily, Norman, Chen, Nguyen managed to have their sentences reduced to life sentences on the 8th of March 2008, with Rush joining them in August 2010. Of course, though, anybody who was keeping track of these various names would have noticed that this leaves Andrew Chan and Maya and Sakamaran, otherwise known as the Ringleaders. The Bali 2. Both Chan and Sakamaran were separated by prosecutors almost immediately, identified as the ringleaders of the entire affair. Unfortunately, this reputation would be an idea that often repeated itself throughout their appeals. The 2 ringleaders ultimately appealed in 2011 against their death sentences to the Supreme Court of Indonesia, only for each to have their appeals utterly rejected, the grounds for rejection resting entirely on the organizational role that they had taken. However, don't lose faith in the Indonesian justice system just yet, because if there's one thing about the wonderful country which ranks it at 102nd in the world in the corruption index, it's that we can trust the politicians, right? In 2014, both Chan and Sakamaran appealed for clemency from then Indonesian President Joko Widodo, a brave move considering the man had been quoted earlier this year stating that he was aiming for 65 death row executions of drug dealers to be carried out by the end of the year. Unfortunately, on the 30th of December, Sakamaran's plea was rejected, with Chan's rejected on the 22nd of January. An eye for an eye. In the early hours of the 29th of April 2015, Andrew Chan and Myuran Sukumaran would have been roughly dragged from their beds along with 6 other men, 1 Indonesian, 1 Brazilian, and all 4 others Nigerian. From there, they would have been led to a waiting van on Nusa Kambang and Prison Islands, where they would have been driven a short distance and then taken over to several stakes in the grounds, where they would have been blindfolded. The doctor would have placed a black cross with tape over each of their hearts, and then they would have been executed by firing squad. No warning would have been given to Chan, Sukumaran, or their families. The Indonesian system of execution is coldly efficient in that manner. No sooner would they have known that the 29th was their final day than they would have found themselves tied to the stakes and hearing the countdown in a language they didn't speak. At the same time, several vigils were held for Sukumaran and Chan around the entirety of Australia, and a concert was held in their memory, and Amnesty International organised several vigils around the country to mark this contentious happening. Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott stated that the executions were cruel and unnecessary, and several other voices, including the former Chief Justice of Indonesia, described the executions as not only cruel but unconstitutional, most of them having viewed Chan and Sukumaran as having rehabilitated themselves by this point. At the end of the day, no matter your view of what happened to Chan and Sukumaran, whether you believe they deserved it or not, they were executed alone in the dark and away from their families. Both men's families have spoken at length in the media about the pain of losing their loved ones without any chance to say goodbye. Controversies. At this point, many of you must be considering what controversies there are to consider. After all, haven't we already covered the basics of the entire death penalty debate? Well, absolutely. However, to say that the Bali 9 is only an example of the death penalty debate is to simplify it to the greatest extent possible. The first controversy worth mentioning is the claim from Chan and Sukumaran's family that they were asked for a bribe in order to reduce the sentences of the 2 men to 20 years in prison. It would be easy to dismiss this as simply a family clinging at anything to try and save their loved ones' lives, but it is worth mentioning that both Chan and Sukumaran's original lawyer and the Australian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Julie Bishop, all came out in support of this claim, the latter claiming it as concerning. Don't think that this covers the Australian government, however. A further controversy is about their lack of action. Back when the death penalties were announced, then Prime Minister John Howard made statements that the youth of Australia should have been aware that death sentences were possible and not to take terrible risks. However, in my book, a terrible risk as a 19-year-old ends with a rash and an awkward trip to the pharmacy, not being executed at the crack of dawn. The final controversy, simply put, is the entire idea of executing those who smuggle drugs for political gain. Several commentators pointed out the relative unpopularity of President Widodo, who at the time of denying the clemency requests of Chan and Sukumaran did not even have a majority in the Indonesian legislature. There are several claims around the Indonesian media, at least the bits that we could read, which furthered the idea that Widodo only executed the 2 not for interest of justice, but for a few points in the opinion polls. Even those who do support the death penalty generally require the reason for the death penalty to be more than just securing your nice cushy job for the next few years. Closing remarks. The Bali 9 is the go-to case of when worlds collide. It's a classic case of the death penalty debate taken to the extreme. It is, of course, worth noting that the reasoning behind these executions is not meaningless. In 2018, 14,996 people died of heroin abuse in the USA, 2,000 in Australia, and an unknown, though estimated high number, in Indonesia. The members of the Bali 9 were clearly criminals. They never once denied this, having all consensually transported heroin. The matters this video have dealt with are all serious, and understandably people will have strongly held views on both sides. However, one thing that the Bali 9 brings forward separately to all of this is the idea of the politicization of these affairs. Both politicians in Indonesia and Australia used the case of the Bali 9 to further their own political goals, losing sight of the fact that ultimately these are 9 individuals, 3 of which have now lost their life. Nguyen died in 2018 from stomach cancer. Ultimately, to understand the Bali 9, you only need to understand one idea, that the punishment of a crime fit the evil caused through the commission of that crime. And the Bali 9 is an example of when 2 different worlds, that of Australia and Indonesia, crashed together in a violent disagreement.